The Magic of the Swatchways by Maurice Griffiths, Chapter 5, The Voice of the Shingle. The cool night wind was murmuring softly across the marshes that stretched unseen towards Tollesbury. As the little pram dinghy was urged forward with rhythmic jerks of the short paddles, the water rustled before its transom bow, and the wash ran in a series of ripples that chased one another along the edge of the mud. Astern, the few lights of West Mersey shimmered on the mudflats on which the black forms of boats lay with their masts at drunken angles. A tall withy festooned with weed loomed up out of the darkness, and Hugh had to ship one paddle hurriedly as the beacon brushed along the dinghy's side. It made a scraping sound, and the stillness was broken by a scuttle from the forward thwart and a crescendo of indignant comments from the third member of our party. "Dry up, Scotty," said Hugh as he put his weight into the oars again. "Keep still, old man, or you'll capsize us." But Scotty was true to his Aberdonian origin and not to be so easily shushed. Until we'd passed Packing Marsh Island and rowed into the quarters, he stood in the bow with his paws on the forward transom, sniffing the variety of smells that was coming from the heaps of sun-dried cockle-shells on the shore, and giving an occasional bark. Seated in the stern sheets of the 8-foot pram, with a suitcase on my knees, I was wondering whether Hugh was wise or not, bringing his Scotty terrier with him, when his voice interrupted my profound debate. "The wind's westerly tonight, Morris," he said, "and there's a fair wind for us. The forecast said easterly winds. I reckon we ought to get round to Harwich tonight if we can, for it may come easterly tomorrow. Ah, there she is." As we slid alongside the little white barge-yacht, Scotty leapt onto her deck, and the sudden release of his weight caused my end of the cranky pram to ship water. But a friendly muzzle with a moist tongue was thrust in my face as I clambered aboard, and I knew he was going to be one of the crew without a doubt. Scotty was the kind of dog that made you feel you couldn't do without him somehow. Seamew was a 6-ton barge-yacht of uncertain vintage and somewhat box-like appearance, with iron lee-boards pivoted on the sides and iron guides to keep them from swinging away from the ship. It was said that many years before she'd had her bottom doubled. My friend Hugh had bought her at West Mersey only a few weeks previously, and as he lived not far from Lowestoft, it was his intention to take her round to the Broads on the first available weekend. I was not without a boat at the time, for I still had Swan, another small barge of a slimmer, less angular type, but with her lee boards working in cases, I supposed it was my ownership of a similar type of craft that induced him to invite me. At any rate, the idea of a coastal passage in a small barge-yacht, which was not by any means seaworthy, appealed to me as a thoroughly sporting venture, with someone else's boat at stake, of course. When I said it had seemed a longish passage, especially between Orford Haven and Lowestoft, for the 26-foot flat-bottomed yacht with no ballast, and I was going to say a rotten hull, my friend, who had owned one other boat only, a half-decker sailing punt which had quietly filled and settled for life at moorings, had only laughed a careless laugh and declared, "Why, the old hooker only draws 18 inches, and if you get caught out in a barge, you just run her ashore." "Ashore? Why, yes, up the beach, anywhere. By the time she touches bottom, there isn't enough water to float a jellyfish, and the waves can't break." I breathed a prayer that we would have no cause to try his theory, and let it go at that. He must have read somewhere that the skippers of the Thames spritsail barges sometimes let their big vessels take the ground on one of the more sheltered sands in the estuary during a blow to ensure a quiet night. We stowed our gear in the cunningly contrived lockers of the overcrowded cabin and sat down to a meal of cold pie, while 2 black eyes set above a shaggy muzzle watched our every movement from the darkness of the cockpit. If one so much as glanced in the direction of the open doors, 2 upright ears would drop simultaneously and an invisible tail thump on the floorboards. I was glad now that Hugh had brought him. It was about 10 o'clock when we set the mainsail and foresail. Seamew had no bowsprit and set only 1 headsail, and ran gently down the quarters past the Nass beacon. There was no cormorant on the drunken old post tonight, I noticed. I wondered musingly as I sat at the tiller where that black gaunt bird had gone. The Nass beacon is so seldom without its sleek figurehead, which turns an angular beak first one way and then the other as you drift past, that he seems to be part of the effigy. But tonight the beacon slipped past in the darkness astern, untenanted, and a solitary light winked far up the Blackwater. The breeze was gradually taking off, and soon after midnight, when the loom of Cone Point was just visible to port, Seamew scarcely had steerage way through the water. The young flood had by now begun, and we were slowly but surely being carried back. "No use drifting back, is there?" said Hugh, and we let go the hook on the edge of Cone Bar and stowed the mainsail. Half an hour later I lay in my bunk listening to the strange noises of a strange craft. A slight swell kept the boat rolling, and she rolled quickly, as all small barges will, rocking from side to side in a frenzy, then unaccountably remaining perfectly still and silent, but for the gurgle of bilge water, for perhaps 10 seconds. A lurch would follow and the rapid rolling begin again. The bilge water sloshed backwards and forth, back and forth under the floorboards, and every now and then one of the lee boards would bang the side close to my head with a noise like a steam pile driver. How Hugh slept through it was not only beyond my understanding, but it positively enraged me. But I must have dozed. I woke up once during the night and found Seamew still rolling. The noise of the bilge water sounded louder, and I put the back of one hand to the floor by my bunk. The water was not over the floorboards, thank goodness, but a cold nose and a moist warm tongue on my wrist reminded me that Scotty was curled up on the mat on the floor. I went to sleep again, fondling one of his ears. "That forecast was right," Hugh's voice was saying. "The wind's easterly this morning." There seemed to be an alarming racket going on as I woke up. The Primus was roaring heartily in the cooking locker. The Seamew's antics of a few hours before had now become chronic. She was pitching and rolling, the lee boards were thudding against the sides with frantic irregularity, the bilge water was washing back and forth with a sound like breakers ahead, and the halyards, which we'd forgotten to frap or tie up, were clattering on the mast. "I've got the kettle on for breakfast," Hugh called out cheerily from the open doors. "I'm just going to give the dog a run ashore if you don't mind getting breakfast ready." It was less than a quarter of a mile to the sandy point of land, and while I stirred the scrambled eggs in the saucepan and swore because the toast would catch, I could see my cheerful skipper giving his dog a run on the beach. Judging from Hugh's attitude as he sat on the edge of the dinghy and tried to make the dog understand why he had brought it for a run ashore, it appeared to be a game of patience. Convinced that it was all a game, Scotty had laid a huge stone at his master's feet and now sat looking up expectantly at him. The proverb, "you can take a horse to the pond but you can't make him drink," came to mind, and I nearly burned the eggs through helpless merriment. Yet when Hugh returned he couldn't see anything funny in it. The dog was simply pig-headed. The breeze was comparatively fresh when we got the anchor aboard and stood out towards the Knoll Buoy and the port tack. The sun appeared through a haze and glinted on the sea, whose heaving surface was of that peculiar opaque and sandy green, with streaks of light and dark shade and flashes of white where crests were breaking, that is so well portrayed in the sea pieces of Van der Velde. Already some of the Breitling sea fishing smacks were on their trawling grounds beyond the bar, their mainsail triced up and Spitfire jibs set halfway along their long bowsprits. Seamew was bounding over the seas in the erratic and light-hearted manner of the small barge yacht. Her weather chine appeared as the waves passed under her, and the tiller required both hands to keep her full and by. It was a dead beat as far as Clacton. The ebb was with us, and we were not making bad headway. But the seas were becoming lumpy, and with no reef in the mainsail, it was a ticklish business humouring the boat over some of the crests. If you luffed into them, the boat carried no way and stopped dead, only to pay off and meet the next on her beam, putting a terrific strain on her iron lee boards. Some of the seas were steep enough to be a positive danger to a flat-bottomed boat which was carrying too much canvas. "We ought to have a reef in," I ventured once, as our weather chine rose above the water and the sea hit our flat bottom with a jarring thump. But her proud owner only laughed in a carefree manner. "Oh, she's doing fine. It's only the way to get a barge to windward to drive her. Besides, I reckon the wind'll take off this afternoon." But it did not, and in a nasty jump of sea off Frinton we were forced to roll down a few turns on the mainsail. The main boom was fitted with the type of roller reefing gear which is actuated by a wire rolling from a reel at the forward end of the boom. This, of course, jammed and caused us to curse it and each other with such volubility that we failed to notice how much ground we lost with wind and the young flood against us. At last we rounded the Naze and were able to lay a course for Harwich Harbour, and when we brought up close to the beach inside Landguard Point, convenient for slipping out in the following morning, and Hugh took Scotty ashore for a look at a lamppost, I began to feel that small barge yachts had their limitations when it came to making coastal passages. You cannot drive them like a keelboat, and as soon as they show signs of carrying too much canvas you have to reef immediately, or sail with your teeth and boat, so to speak, on edge. With a cheerful, reckless skipper like Hugh aboard, and a boat with the unexpected tendernesses of Seamew, I decided I should have to insist on considerably more caution for the remainder of the passage, even though I was only the mate. Sunday was cold, with a pale look about the sun and a slight haze in the sky that gave it an uncertain steely tinge. The wind was blowing somewhat fresh from a little south of east, and bringing a swell with it into the harbour that made breakfast aboard Seamew a precarious affair. One sudden lurch sent Hugh's plate into his lap, and his expression as he retrieved what was left of his fried kipper was such a study of injured annoyance that I failed to stop a cup of tea from following the plate. That cabin was not large enough to hold all of us for the next few minutes, and Scotty wisely retreated to the cockpit. This wind'll just about fetch around Orford Ness, Hugh observed with his usual recklessness, when he had subsided and eaten my kipper while I was busily clearing up the mess. And once round the Ness we'll carry it abeam to Lowestoft, and boy, he had in the manner of a talky fan, we'll sure show 'em what a cute little barge can do. I managed to induce him to roll in one reef in the mainsail before starting, and by the time we'd worked slowly out against the second half of the flood tide and slipped over the Platter Sands, where a confused sea treated Seamew as though she were more of a box than her owner would admit, we were glad to have taken the precaution. There was still a strong tide running against us, and in spite of a fresh wind we seemed to make slow progress past Felixstowe Front, with its pier and row of white beach huts, and the mouth of the Deben opened out slowly between the sand dunes on the Felixstowe ferry side and the Bordsey cliffs. But before the coastguard cottages near Orford Haven came into view, where the Orr River meets the sea amid a dreaded nest of shingle banks, worse indeed for their uncertainties and dangers than Woodbridge Haven, the ebb set in, and the low-lying land began to slip by perceptibly. "The wind's backed a bit," said Hugh once. "There's Orford Ness Lighthouse, and I can't quite point it." The black and white striped pillar of the lighthouse appeared over the horizon a little to windward of our forestay. Making as much leeway as she was, Seamew could never weather the Ness, and we should have to make a tack out to sea. The wind was freshening by degrees, and Seamew was pounding badly at times, occasionally getting a sickening thump under her weather chine from a heaped-up sea. When we got past the slight lee afforded by the whiting bank, the seas were all much bigger, and had to be carefully manoeuvred. The beach, known here as Shingle Street, looked particularly desolate as we closed in on it, for there was nothing to see but miles of wind-swept shingle, with here and there a patch of coarse grass, an occasional hut, and in the distance a long line of gaunt telegraph poles. "Once we've weathered the Ness," Hugh called out with a forced gaiety, "we'll have the wind free, and we can put into Southwold if it gets too uncomfortable." Holding on to the cockpit coaming as the barge banged into the hollows and threw herself over the crests with a wild motion like an enraged mule, I wondered how much comfort there was to be had already. But the sight of Scotty curled up on his mat under the cabin table, uncomplaining and obviously prepared to go wherever his master would take him, reassured me. The roar of the seas as they broke on the shore in an unending line of heaving white foam was sinister, as though the fates only waited for us to round the Ness before mocking at us for our foolishness. "Better not get too close to the lee shore," I ventured once, when the noise of the seas and the scream of the Shingle as the spent fury rushed down the beach in a sullen torrent of speckled foam almost deafened us. "Oh, all right. Lee-ho." Seamew swung into the wind, her canvas flogging, hovering for one moment as a sea broke against her bow, dropped suddenly into the hollow beyond, and paid off on the new tack. Then began a long plunge away from the dreaded shore. I glanced into the cabin and caught sight of two black eyes watching me with a puzzled look, while beneath them a long nose, ending in a shiny black button, was flanked on either side by a row of whiskers that bristled out with an air of intense indignation. Scotty was standing up, for the sudden change of angle had upset him, and he wondered if that was all right and as his master intended. "All right, Scotty, lie down." The ears dropped quickly at my voice, and in a minute he'd made the best of the new conditions and settled once more under the table. Once again on the starboard tack we pointed down the coast, the only sail in sight. But the wind had backed still more, and to our chagrin we found we could scarcely lay the town of Aldborough, nestling under a hill 4 miles ahead. The seas were nearly all breaking now, and once or twice Seamew gave a lurch to leeward that stressed a dangerously small limit of safety. The Aldborough Ridge buoy passed slowly abeam to seaward, appearing every now and then against the hard wave-topped line of the horizon, like a policeman's helmet above a surging crowd of people. "We'll have to reef again," Hugh called out as a sudden lurch nearly threw us onto the lee combing. "I can hardly hold her." I took a fearful glance at the deserted shore, but a cable's length away, and then we worked hurriedly to roll some more turns in the main boom. When we'd finished, there was the equivalent of 3 reefs rolled into the mainsail, and the lee shore was appreciably closer. As we gathered way again, Scotty came into the cockpit, wagging his tail and whining. A glance into the cabin showed what had troubled him. "Good Lord, the water's over the cabin floor." Hugh looked at the breakers under our lee. "This pounding straining her," he said. "But I've got to keep her going, old man. Will you try to pump her out?" The semi-rotary pump in the well would not suck at first, and I spent many minutes trying to prime it with a mug of seawater. At last it started to throw out absurd jets of water, and for some time I sat working the handle. But soon it sucked air, although the water was washing about in the cabin up to the level of the lee berth, and I found I could just not pump any more while she was sailing, as the pipe led to one side of the keel amidships, and of course was uncovered as she heeled. It should have had a pipe leading to each bilge with a 2-way cock. Without any warning, a harder squall than usual laid the boat over until her lee rail was submerged as she hovered in this position. A sharp snap forward was followed by a ripping of canvas as the mainsail suddenly unrolled in a huge bag. For one moment I felt Seamew was going right over, but with the helm hard down she sprang into the wind, while the main boom with its folds of canvas swept across the well and threatened to brain us. "The reefing wire's gone," was all Hugh said, and for a moment we looked at one another in dismay. That wretched bit of wire which wound the boom round on its reel had parted, and all the reefs had unrolled. Like nearly all mainsails made for roller reefing, it had no row of reef points and cringles for such an emergency, and somehow or other we had to get those turns in again before the barge went ashore. I said as much to Hugh, but his theory came to mind, and he pointed to leeward, where the seas were sweeping up the beach and returning, only to attack again in a smother of white foam with an unceasing roar. "We could sail her straight in," he shouted, "and beach her. She's a barge and wouldn't—" "Don't be an arse," I replied savagely, and meant it. There was nothing for it but to let go the anchor on its full scope and pray that the cable would not part. As I veered it out, the chain felt very small and rusty, as though it would never stand the strain. But the anchor seemed to take a hold, and there we lay with our sails loosely furled, perhaps 100 yards off the beach, pitching wildly and snubbing with horrible crashes on the cable as the boat's head rose to a crest. With the little barge jumping about as she was, it was no easy task to roll the main boom with the sail neatly round it by hand, but in due course we had about 8 turns in it, and the ends lashed so that it could not unroll again. Nor, incidentally, could we put in any more reefs unless we had the sail down again and untied the lashings. Meanwhile the wind had increased, and from the hard, cold look of the horizon, which was broken by a dark, heaving line of crests, it was obviously going to blow, and blow hard from the eastwards. And no boat should be on this coast with a gale in that quarter. The afternoon was far advanced by now, and it would be dark in an hour or two. No harbour lay further north nearer than Southwold, some 13 miles away, but that place, with its narrow entrance, its shallow bar on which the seas would be breaking, and the strong cross-set of the tide between the piers, would be a death-trap in the darkness. There was nothing for it but either to run all the way back to Harwich and leave the boat, say in Pinmill until next weekend, or run into Orford Haven and go into Slaughton Quay near Aldborough. It seemed cruel to think that this very sheltered river was even now but a quarter of a mile beyond that deadly Shingle beach. "If she won't claw off," Hugh said in a queer, high-pitched voice as we set the mainsail once more, "we can at least sail her hard for the beach, and a wave would help us to get her well up. I've always heard that a small barge—" But I didn't wait to hear more of his pet theory and began to haul in the straining cable. The idea of deliberately putting a 6-ton barge out on that beach in which 6-foot seas were bursting into wind-driven spray seemed too mad to contemplate. Of course, we couldn't possibly thresh out against this rising wind, or the mainsail blew away and she went ashore. Then it meant a jump for our lives, and heaven help the boat. She would be filled with shingle and her planking strewn along the beach in a few hours. One way and another, we had got ourselves into a pretty fix, and I hadn't as much faith as I should have liked in the boat or her skipper to get me out of it. As soon as we had the anchor catted and the foresail set, Seamew heeled over and showed that, reefed down as she was, she still needed the most careful handling. The seas smashed against her weather bow, driving her head off, and as the squalls laid her over, the water thudded heavily under her flat bottom and shook her whole fabric. For an hour we plunged and tossed into the seas, drenched with spray, shaken and apprehensive. The sight of the breakers under our lee and the continuous roar dinning in our ears made one's heart turn to water. And after the first 3 tacks, when it appeared we had not gained a yard, I began to experience a dull fear that of course the boat could claw off. But I was frightened and felt that Hugh secretly shared my feelings. The cabin floor was awash and the berth cushions had long been soaked beyond hope. Scotty had vacated his mat, which was floating back and forth across the floor, and now stood on his hind legs, clutching the cockpit coaming with his forepaws, his grisly muzzle facing the wind. There was an air of defiance about his rigid body, a show of unquenchable spirit of the Highlands that attracted me, and when he snapped savagely at a dash of salt water that flew into his face, I felt that if he could treat the elements like that, why shouldn't we? It put heart into us, and we drove the little barge harder, oblivious of her straining timbers and complaining hull. At last we'd opened up the nests once more and were able to ease the sheets a little. With steep green seas leaping up at her port side, Seamew scurried back along the coast towards the mouth of the Ore River. It was already getting dusk, and it seemed a toss-up whether we could pick our way between the deadly shoals into the haven before it came too dark to make out the leading marks or to attract a pilot. The sea was taking on a darker shade as the light began to fail, and the bigger seas looked black in their hollows beneath the white of their crests. Seamew, reeling and lurching, staggered on, her wake hissing out from under her broad transom and colliding with the waves as they raced across it. The dinghy's filled, Maurice. I had almost forgotten the pram, but the skipper's remark revealed our little boat towing with only the forward transom showing. Luckily we had lashed the paddles in it, but I gave anxious glances at the bar-taught painter, watching for signs of its parting. At last, in the gathering dusk, we approached Orford Haven. Against the dark line of the beach and the pine trees beyond, we could see the line of white that marked the entrance, a boiling cauldron of water wherein, here and there, shingle banks rose up like backs of whales and were smothered again and again. It was a sight that would test the courage of the bravest, for as we rushed towards the place, it seemed as though we were heading for certain destruction. "My God, there isn't any entrance!" Hugh's ejaculation was understandable, but I'd been in once before, and scared though I was, I believed that I might be able to feel out the channel where Seamew's light draught could take her. But I wished fervently that one of the pilots would come out and take us in. Already the sound of the seas was getting louder with a deadly roar. "Look, there's somebody waving." I followed the direction of his hand and saw to my relief a dim figure, looking absurdly small on the beach, waving a flag. It was one of the pilots, and he was going to flag us in, as it was too bad on the bar for their boat to put off. On we swept with wind and seas, chasing us like the fiends of hell, our swamped pram surging along on the end of an already stranded painter. Acting as a drogue, perhaps that little dinghy was saving us from being pooped, swamped by a sea breaking over our open cockpit. But the pilot, where was he? He'd gone. No, there he was, waving again. God, which way? Port? Not through that mass of breakers. Heavens, that's a shoal. No, he's waving again. Starboard. There's a big sea coming. Hold on. Hugh was looking astern while I wrestled with the tiller. No time to look astern. I can hear it roaring, roaring, coming on, mounting high, tumbling over the shingle, streaming in on our ears on either side. Mad, mad that it was. The whole place made with fury at losing us. No, they're only jeering at us. Those hell fiends might get us yet. We're only now over the bar. What's he doing now? Why doesn't he wave? Oh, God, which way? There's white water all around us. With an angry roar, the comber is breaking close astern of us. Water on deck, running over the coamings, boiling, roaring, cascading. Seamew being carried wildly towards the shore. Little Scotty savagely snapping at the spray. She's broaching too. I can't hold her. The tiller will break if she doesn't. Ah, she's on her course again. And the pilot's waving us to starboard. Why doesn't he stand higher? I can't see. It's getting too dark against those trees. Never mind. We're in the river now. I could have sworn I heard the Shingle give a prolonged screech of anger at our escape. Through heaven-sent smooth water we sailed slowly with the wind abeam, its force broken into occasional gusts by the high bank of deserted shingle that separated us from the fury of the sea. Where the channel divided at Havergate Island we turned to port and entered the narrow and tortuous Butley Creek, where willy-waws chased one another across the placid surface, and our wash broke on the mud on either side. An hour later, with the cabin partially dried and a hot meal eaten, I went on deck to bail out the pram dinghy. Seamew lay quietly at anchor with the mud of the narrow creek within a few yards on either side, while the gusts of wind roared through her rigging and rustled through the long sedge-grass on the bank. From the direction of Shingle Street was coming a continuous booming sound, the sullen anger of the sea in mighty conflict with the shore. And when, later, I took the pluckiest member of the crew ashore in the dinghy and felt his warm tongue against my hand as I sat on the grass in the darkness, I couldn't help gazing back at the little white barge, whose round portholes showed bright from the cabin lamp, and wondered what would have become of us had we tried to push on to Southwold in her on this blustering night. The roar of the Shingle gave me an idea.